Welcome to the Lida Citroën podcast, your space to grow your influence and elevate your personal brand. In each episode, you'll hear inspiring stories, expert insights, and practical strategies to help you stand out, lift up others, and leave your mark on your team, your community, or the world. If you're ready to make your voice heard, you're in the right place. Let's dive in.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the Lida Citroën podcast. If this is your first time here, I'm so glad you decided to tune in and check us out and see what this podcast is all about. If you've been with us before, welcome back. I'm so happy that you've returned for more content and more learning. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that gets covered a lot. And I was a little hesitant to go there because I thought, everybody talks about imposter syndrome. But we recently did a survey, a poll on LinkedIn, and found out that it is still one of your most important topics. It is still something that you're all wrestling with. And so we're going to dive in and we're going to talk about imposter syndrome. We're going to talk about what you can do with imposter syndrome, how to make sure that you use it to your advantage and that it doesn't cripple you in your career. And to kick us off, and I kind of wrestled with this because I wasn't sure this is where I wanted to start, but to kick us off, I want to share that this isn't something I necessarily have struggled with. And I remember years ago, I hired an executive coach because as a coach, I love to hire coaches just to keep my skills sharp and make sure that I'm staying true to the work that I'm doing. So I employ coaches as well as coach other people. And this coach at the beginning had said to me, "Well, talk to me about your imposter syndrome." And I asked her to clarify what she meant. And she said, it's when you feel like a fraud or you feel like you're worried people are going to figure out you really don't belong there. Or, maybe you're in over your head. And I struggled. I said, I just don't, I really don't feel that. And she goes, well, of course you do. Everybody does. So, and she kept pressing and pressing. And I think what I probably did, because I am a people pleaser, is I probably just came up with something, which wasn't the most authentic thing to do, the most real thing to do. Um, but I don't suffer on a daily basis from feelings of, being found out, being a fraud, being um, somebody who's representing something that I'm not. Now, I will say that I represent and I work with a lot of clients who deal with this, and some deal with this on a day-to-day basis. So when I was preparing for this episode, I did think a lot about the clients that I have helped navigate this, and we'll talk more about that. And that's not to say that I don't have feelings of, you know, like, oh my gosh, do I deserve to be here? Or I know sometimes if it's a really big event and I look at the other people who are on stage and who I'm going to be following or who are going to be following me, I might think, how humbling that I get to be in that company, and I get butterflies and I get excited. And I guess where it doesn't go for me is the feeling of I'm faking it or I'm being somebody that I'm not. And I think it's because I've worked really, really hard at being genuine. And that takes a lot of hard work, folks. It is not something you just decide to do and it shows up. But when we talk about imposter syndrome, this idea of misrepresenting ourselves or wondering if we are over our head or we have stretched too far or we are going to get found out as, not deserving, not belonging, it shows up in things like when people don't raise their hand in a meeting, right? When maybe you're sitting in the back of the room and it's an important conversation and high stakes, high influence stakeholders are in the room and you've got an idea, you want to share something, but you sit on it and you sit on it and you don't say exactly what you were thinking. And then you watch someone else do it. You watch someone else raise their hand and maybe not even as eloquently or as thoughtfully, they offer your same idea and they get praise for it. They get recognition for it. They get impact from it. And what you've realized is there is a cost to that feeling of imposter syndrome, and that cost of silence, how it impacts your career. So it's the idea that, if we're waiting until we feel we've earned the spot, or waiting until we don't feel that we don't belong there, if we're waiting for all those things to happen, that cost of silence is actually a cost of influence, because the person next to you, who again may not have all the skills, all the thoughtfulness, all the credentials, offers that same idea and it benefits them, and you sat on it. And I've worked with a lot of very capable, very credentialed, very experienced leaders and entrepreneurs who have so much to say. And in conversation with me, they will share these ideas. They will bring forward this vision and this mission and these thoughts that are so well constructed. And my question will be, so in that meeting that was so high stakes, were you able to share that? And I hear the same thing over and over. I kept refining it. I kept working on it. I kept thinking I would get the idea better. And by the time I got a little bit of courage and was about to share, someone had already shared it, or they'd moved on from that idea. So it was no longer relevant. And if we're worried that someone is going to figure out that we're not as good or we're not as capable, then we're sitting on an idea. And as you've heard me say, if you've listened to this podcast or you've read my books, if you're sitting on that idea too long, that could have been the idea that changes everything. The idea or the suggestion or the question or the challenge that makes all the difference. And you're sitting on it because you don't feel it's ready. So this idea of imposter syndrome really kind of came up in the late 1970s, if you can remember that far back, where a lot of us were told that if we feel like a fraud, if we feel like we haven't earned the right yet, that that's really something within us, that it isn't necessarily our environment, it isn't society, it isn't culture, it's some deficit or defect that we have. And this original idea of imposter syndrome, which kind of again came up in like 1978, 1979, focused mostly on high achieving women, because these women found themselves starting to penetrate those higher ranks in companies, those positions of influence and authority within, government, companies, and they started questioning whether they belonged there, whether this was a conscious or an unconscious thing. Was it, I'm put in this position because they needed to check a box and put a woman there, or did I really earn the spot? And all those ideas started to erode performance, which we'll talk about in a second. But there was an interesting and fascinating research study by a woman named Basima Tufik, and she's from MIT Sloan School of Management. And she's done tremendous amount of research in the idea of imposter syndrome. And she talks about there being this alternative silver lining. And she says that people with imposter syndrome, or beliefs around imposter syndrome, all the things we just talked about, that it manifests and it can show up in negative ways, which we'll unpack, but it can also show up in positive ways. That these people also tend to be very hyper focused on other people. So they tend to watch others, they listen better, they ask good questions, and they are often ranked as more empathetic by their peers. So her research says it turns out that feeling a little unsure can actually, in some ways, make you a better collaborator. Interesting. So, is this something we should pursue? Should we look for imposter syndrome and try to embrace it? Well, I'm not going to advocate for that. because I want you to be a good collaborator. I want you to feel empathetic and be a good listener and be other focused, not because of the symptoms of imposter syndrome, but because you know that that's important to leadership. So the goal isn't to create self-doubt, but when we can navigate our feelings, when we can look at self-doubt and low confidence and a lack of executive presence and say, okay, but is this working for me the way it should? Is this helping other people but not helping me? And what can I do to make sure that I am growing into my leadership voice, my leadership style in the way that is right for me? Those are the questions I want us to talk about. So, first, let's kind of normalize what this imposter syndrome phenomenon is. And what's interesting is, and I credit, that coach that I hired that I talked to you about at the beginning, because she was going off of correct information. A lot of studies have been done around, US as well as global presence of imposter syndrome. And one said that 70% of people experience imposter syndrome at some point in their lives. So she was absolutely correct in thinking that most likely I was part of that 70%. So I lived with imposter syndrome. What I learn now is I'm probably that outlier 30% who, sure, I get moments of insecurity and sure, I get moments of lack of confidence, but it doesn't root in imposter syndrome. What imposter syndrome can really do when it is rooted, when it becomes our day-to-day default, is it does lead to things like lower job satisfaction. I don't feel happy in my job, probably because I don't enjoy it. I don't feel like I belong here. It roots in people who show reduced performance confidence. They don't feel that they are working to the level that they can, and therefore there's more left on the table. There's more left on the plate, if you will, and they're not doing everything that they're capable of. Imposter syndrome does tend to increase burnout and the risk of burnout. It is a hard, weight to carry every day if you feel like any moment someone's going to figure out you don't belong there. You don't have the skills, you don't have the credentials, you don't have the experience to do the work that you were hired for. That's an extra burden that you are carrying every single day. So the risk of burnout is very, very high. People who describe feelings of imposter syndrome have a tendency to overwork, and they do this to compensate. So they're over editing their messages. They're over scripting in their mind before they open their mouth, right? Which is that person who doesn't speak up in a meeting because they want to make sure they get it just perfect, with the hopes that nobody will look at them and say, "What are you talking about? Do you even know what you're doing? And therefore, do you even belong there?" Right? That's the fear. They're second guessing themselves. So they avoid speaking up. They avoid raising their hand and leading, right? Taking on those stretch opportunities or promoting an idea or raising a challenge that, again, could be the thing that changes everything. So people with imposter syndrome will also tend to, and you might ask yourself if you do this, they will tend to attribute success and achievement to luck rather than their competence. So when they do something really right and they get attention for it and they get praise for it, somebody with imposter syndrome will say, "Well, I guess right place, right time," or I just was lucky. It just happened that the cards fell in my favor." Instead of owning the fact that everything that they worked on, everything that they did got them to that moment and crossed that finish line to be successful. Imposter syndrome left untreated does erode executive presence. And this is probably the part that makes me the saddest, because it's that second guessing, that over editing, that hesitation, that questioning of competency that I have seen in some of the most brilliant, heartfelt, capable people. And I start to see them become small. They start sitting lower in their chair. They keep their camera off on a Zoom meeting. They don't interject when the conversation is going sideways. They don't raise their hand to present the budget or present a recommendation that they know is good for the team. And they start shrinking. And that shrinking, it breaks my heart, because the person who may be less qualified, less thoughtful, less competent, just by being louder and having more bravado, is going to take an idea that maybe isn't as well thought out and bring it forward. And of course, this is not all the time, but it does happen sometimes. And when I see people get small in their own space, in their own skin, in their executive presence, it makes me sad, because I know what they're capable of and they know what they're capable of. But in those moments when it matters, they can't get there. So we need to fix that. And if that's something that you're dealing with, then we need to look at how we can stretch that, how we can fix that gap. Because there is often a gap between the way you see yourself, right, and the way other people see you. So, one of the things we can do when we are trying to solve for feelings of imposter syndrome is really get data. And data is valuable. Data says, I don't think I'm a good fit. I don't think I belong here. The data tells us, or our mind's data tells us, look around. Everybody else has, PhDs and masters, and they've been doing this a lot longer than I have. Therefore, I'm in the wrong place. That's what our mind's data tells us. But is it the data that we really need to work off of? Or is it feelings of insecurity that are creeping in? That's definitely something we need to fix. And looking at, okay, we're assuming those feelings that I don't belong here, I'm not competent enough, they're going to figure it out, are negative. But what if they're not? What if those feelings can be put to good use, as that researcher Tufek says, and we can use them to raise our standards, to grow higher consciousness with our team and conscientiousness, to lean into better preparation and effort. So that feeling that we called imposter syndrome, what if it can be reframed into something that allows us to grow in more productive ways? That's an interesting question. And does imposter syndrome just show up the moment you leave your house and you go to work, or does it show up in those moments when you're stretching? Most of the clients I have worked with will say that it shows up in those stretch moments, the times when you're in a new environment, maybe a new job, a new team, a new position, right? And you're asked to do something maybe a little different than you did before, or you're taking on a bigger role. Your team has now absorbed another team. So you were managing 5 people, now you're managing 15. Or you're expanding your identity or your influence, becoming more visible on LinkedIn, becoming more of a public speaker on your topic. It's those expanding roles, those stretch roles, where imposter syndrome can creep in. That's more typical than the person who says, every morning I leave my house, I feel like a fraud. That isn't what I've run into as often. So, a couple reasons it's so common, and it is growing. We are seeing it more, and we are seeing it with men as well. I think where it was identified initially as something that high visibility women were dealing with, or women that were increasing their visibility in different roles, we're seeing a lot of it with men. And I'm going to point to social media. I think social media has a lot to do with how we interact and how we judge ourselves. We are comparing ourselves to the success of others. So Think about that job seeker who has been at it for months, and they go to LinkedIn and all they see is people that do similar work, announcing a new job, announcing a promotion, announcing a new job, and they think there's got to be something wrong with me. Or these highly curated successes that we see on social media that tell us that's how your life should be, because this is how my life is. And therefore, if your life doesn't look like this, there must be something about you. That is so toxic and so dangerous. And we all fall victim of it. We all fall victim of it because we look at these examples of people that maybe we grew up with or worked with or mentored, and it seems like by what we see on social media, they have far passed us up. So why haven't we? What is it about us that's being held back? And that also is really hard to navigate. But here's a thought just to keep in the back of your mind. I use the phrase highly curated. And there is so much about curation that happens on social media. Most people don't put the day-to-day that happens in their life. And if they do put a challenge or something that went wrong or a difficulty, they're framing it either in, I'm about to start this journey, so I need your prayers and support, or I went through this journey and here are the 5 things I learned. So it's not necessarily a real day-to-day experience. And I think we have to be careful looking at someone's success online and thinking, why am I not having that success? Why don't I have that big, beautiful house? Why don't I look that way or sound that way or have all those friends? And that person who we're modeling ourselves after isn't necessarily showing us everything. And that's really dangerous. We see it happening with kids. I could talk hours about how, there's so much risk in this. There's so much opportunity, but there's so much risk. And AI, as fabulous as it is, as helpful as it is, can also be a fuel to imposter syndrome, right? Maybe you write something and you think you've written it really well and you take it into AI and just ask it to clean it up a little and it rewrites the whole thing and it rewrites it so much better, or at least what you view is so much better. And so you think, okay, now I start to doubt my writing ability. Now I start to question my own judgment, my own thinking, my own critical thinking skills because AI does it better. But AI isn't you, and you are flawed, and you have quirks, and you have personality, and you have a voice. None of those things does AI have. So when you're evaluating what the AI output is as better, is it better because it sounds better for you, or it is better because it's more accurate? I mean, really unpack that. And I find one of the things that I get into is patterns of maybe I'm not that good a writer because look at what AI just did in cleaning up my work. And I quickly catch that because I know I'm a good writer. I have 7 books under my title. I've been a freelance writer for 15 years and paid for it. I've been paid for it. So I know there's validity there. And I can learn from the AI. It's not replacing me. So we have to use these tools, use social media to inspire you, to get ideas, to foster your creativity, to maybe find, examples of ways you can do things differently. Use AI to get sharper, to ideate, to think about new ways of looking at the same material, but not to compare yourself to it. That's where it gets dangerous. And that's where it gets really scary when we start to internalize it. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to work with an executive coach? I've had the honor of working with professionals, entrepreneurs, and executives in over 38 countries, helping them navigate the career process through the lens of personal branding and reputation management. The tools that I use allows us to co-create a strategy that puts you in the best position for control and influence over your career and your target community. If you're interested in learning more about personal branding, let's talk. So what do we do? What do we do when these thoughts of self-doubt and am I a fraud? Are they going to figure it out? Am I in the wrong place? Have I been acting a part, being in a role rather than being myself? If those thoughts start creeping in, how do you stop it? Well, the first is to separate feelings from facts. You might feel unsure. You might feel self doubt. You might feel over your head. But are you really? When you look around and everybody, sitting to the right and left of you in a meeting and you start comparing yourself to their credentials, their experience, the number of papers they've authored, the data that they've culled, and you start comparing yourself to all that. Is it fact or is it a feeling? One client that I worked with, she really leaned into this imposter syndrome and she's like, I do worry every day that I'm going to get fired because there's no way I can hold my own among the people I work with. And we started pulling apart. Okay, so she was a recent hire. She was a younger in her career. She didn't have a PhD. She had a master's. I think she may have had two. But she didn't have a PhD. She didn't have 20 years of experience. She didn't have all those things. And that was the benchmark she held herself against. And I said, "Well, then why did they hire you?" And she said, "Well, I'd been involved in this, in this career that was valuable to the clients that this company was now pursuing." I said, "Okay, so you bring experience and insight and industry knowledge on this industry that your company, that your employer was interested in learning more about." And she said, "Yes." I said, "Okay, so let's put the other people's credentials off to the side. What expertise do you bring?" And she started unpacking that and listing things that weren't just experience, but really fell into the category of expertise. I said, "Okay, so you've been at this company year and a half. According to them, more recent. She's a recent hire." I said, "What have you done in that year and a half?" And she started listing off some of the successes she's had, some of the wins, some of the impact and the differences she'd made. And we looked at her list of her industry knowledge, her experience, her wins and successes. And I said to her, "Do you think your employer views that as valuable?" And she goes, "Well, yes, of course it's valuable. I helped them win this new piece of business because of my experience." So we started looking at what was actually data, what was actually fact, and took her eyes off of what she was feeling about her own insecurities and her own discounting of her accomplishments. And sometimes you have to do that. I have something that I have on my computer and I also have physically in my office, and I call it a kudos file. And it's KUDOS, kudos, right? People saying I did a great job or I really helped them. I provided something that was meaningful. And yes, when I get those comments, I save them. I've gotten them in the form of letters and, note cards, feedback surveys, assessments, and emails from people who've just said, that message really made a difference for me. Here's how I used it. And I want to thank you for that. And I save them because that is data. That's feedback. And that's feedback that was sometimes unsolicited, where somebody took the time to share with me that my message or my training or my book really helped them. And I think that's really important. So if I'm feeling low or kind of despondent, I will go to those kudos files, and sometimes I'll take out the note cards and I'll just kind of read through them and look at the paper and feel the texture of the envelope, or I'll look at the electronic ones that I have in my email, and it's the data. It takes me out of that feeling like maybe I don't have what it takes, that momentary thing, and it pulls me back into the facts. So think about setting something like that up for yourself. A wins file, a kudos file, where you start documenting and capturing those information sources that are telling you you are the right person, you've done good, here's evidence of that. And then in those moments when you're either in the imposter syndrome cycle or you're just feeling low, you have that data. It's not necessarily your opinion, it's other people's opinion. And I think there's also a need to reframe the narrative. And that's where self-talk comes in, and I do spend a lot of time in my books. I know I talk about it in The New Rules of Influence, I talk about it in Control the Narrative, and in my books for the military, that our need and our absolute importance to tell ourselves positive things could not be more valid and necessary than it is today. The world, social media, the news, maybe even some toxic friends groups, your workplace might be filling your head with ideas or feelings that you don't belong. You need to reframe that. If there is data, if there's evidence, if there's proof that you are in the right place at the right time, then work on your self talk. Instead of saying to yourself, I don't belong here, I better not raise my hand because they'll see that I really am foolish and don't know what I'm doing. Or you'll raise you're questioning whether you should lead a project. Reframe that and say to yourself things like, I'm still learning. I have done a lot in the short time I've been here, but I am still learning and I'm growing. And anytime there's growth, there's going to be discomfort. Anytime there's learning, there's going to be questions, right? Start framing that differently for yourself. And be careful telling yourself, I suffer from imposter syndrome. If you tell yourself that over and over and over, then the cascade of consequences, right? The reduced visibility, the lack of credibility, all of those things that we talked about at the beginning, those things burrow in and they take root. When you catch yourself going there, just try reframing it. Is this imposter syndrome? Not really. Maybe it's just I'm having a moment of not feeling my best. Let me go and reread that performance evaluation where my boss told me what a potential high impact leader I am in this company. Let me go read that email from that client telling me how much my work and attention to detail made a difference in that project. Let me go reread those things, because when you can calibrate your internal brand, how you see yourself, you're actually calibrating and sometimes recalibrating your external brand. You're helping other people see who you are and what you're capable of. And it does start with you. A good question to think about is, what do people trust you for? What do people come to you for? What do they rely on you for? That's value right there. What do they refer you to? What opportunities do they suggest you raise your hand for? That's personal branding in action. And being able to navigate that and recalibrate that, it starts with you. And I'm going to ask you to go one step further. I'm going to ask you to normalize being more visible, raising your hand. Stop avoiding conversations which might be a little bit past your comfort zone, and lean into them. Be part of those conversations. Ask questions if you have questions. Offer ideas and suggestions and challenges if you have them. Sure, somebody might have that same idea. Sure, somebody in the room might question why you asked that. But what if you asking that or suggesting that is the thing that changes everything. You hear me say that all the time. Don't withdraw from those situations. Lean into them. Maybe speak before you're 100% ready. Maybe you're 90% ready or 80% ready. In a podcast I did, I think it was episode 20, maybe the one right before this, where I interviewed Mark Vandermeer. We talked about doing things at 75% of your best rather than 100%, because we can spend our whole life waiting till we get to 100%. But 75% could be exactly what other people need, and it could be really, really good. But you could spend all your time waiting till you get to 100% and the opportunity has passed. If this sounds like too big a stretch, then try sharing your ideas and your thoughts and your questions in smaller groups, lower risk environments. Maybe that's what gives you the confidence, and you'll build a pattern of visible contribution. Because if I don't see you, if I don't hear you, then how do I know who you are, what you stand for, and what you can offer? If you're chasing perfectionism, which is often what imposter syndrome circles around, then work with a coach, work with a therapist, and understand why you're chasing perfectionism. Why are you waiting until it's 100%? Where does that critical self come from, that rigid perfectionism? Was it a parent? Was it a teacher? Was it a partner who instilled these beliefs in you? And do they still serve you? I'm not a therapist. I can't answer that for you. I am a coach, and I work with a lot of clients to kind of unpack this. But we need to reframe those ideas of perfectionism into ideas of excellence. And excellence isn't saying it's perfect, because we're human beings. Remember that kudos file. Remember the evidence-based confidence. Track those outcomes. Track what you're doing right. Document them, put them someplace you can see on a daily basis if you need to get your confidence back. And then anchor your confidence in those results, because those results are proof that you know what you're doing. You're the right person for the right role. Even if it's a little bit of a stretch, you're growing into it. Someone saw your potential. Someone believes in you. And stop doubting yourself, because that doubt is going to erode everything everyone around you is counting on. So, circling back to the beginning, the question is, what if imposter syndrome is actually proof that you're stepping into a bigger level of influence? What if all those feelings of questioning and self-doubt and unsureness and lack of confidence that you're labeling yourself with, what if those are just the discomfort that comes with growth? When you exercise new muscles, right? You go to the gym and you're using different weights and you're exercising new muscles. Does it feel great at the beginning? No, it feels terrible and it hurts and you're sore and your body aches. Well, maybe that's the same thing happening here. Maybe because you're pushing yourself to a new level of brand fitness or career fitness instead of physical fitness, maybe the discomfort that you're feeling, the pain, the sore muscles, maybe that's just the growth happening. And it isn't because you're in the wrong place. It's because you're managing this process and being open to what this process can reveal. So again, I'm going to ask you to try not to feel like a fraud. Reframe that. Don't stay silent. Stop playing small. If you're in the back of the room, move to the middle of the room or the front of the room. Turn your camera on in those Zoom or Teams meetings. Lean on your experience. Lean on everything that you know has gotten you here. Understand that what you could be feeling is in fact growth and expansion and becoming bigger and more successful and more influential. Confidence is built in evidence and action, not in the absence of doubt. So, removing the doubt is part of the equation, but you've got to align what you feel inside with what you're showing on the outside. And I love this statement. I came up with it as I was doing some brainstorming, and it said, "Your influence grows the moment you stop feeling or waiting to feel ready." The moment you stop waiting to feel ready. I had somebody ask me the other day, they just got married and they were like, when after you've been married, do you feel like, people are ready to have have a child and start their family? And I was like, how could I possibly answer that for you? Right. This was a client who's actually still in grad school. And she said, but isn't there a time when you feel ready? I said, well, emotionally, you might get ready, but you're never going to have enough money in the bank. You're never going to have a big enough house. You're never going to have all the things that you think you need to check a box for before you start having a family. So you have a family when you start having a family. And I'm not trying to minimize that there are certain things that set you up for better success. But if you're constantly waiting for your confidence to catch up, or you're constantly waiting for someone to validate you, you may be waiting a long time. And what if you've been ready already? What if you've been ready and these opportunities just keep putting themselves in front of you and you've looked at them and said, "Oh, when I'm ready, I'm going to take advantage of that." And then you've watched it go away. Well, the next time one shows up, maybe tell yourself you are ready. Maybe tell yourself this is the one you're going to try. You're going to do your best, because that's all we can ask of you. And maybe instead of telling yourself that you suffer from imposter syndrome, tell yourself that sure, you have moments where you need more clarity, and sure, you have moments where you feel that discomfort and those butterflies in your stomach. But maybe tell yourself you're part of that 30% that doesn't deal with imposter syndrome instead of the 70%. And if you are part of the 70%, then work with someone to move through it, because that's holding you back. And you are capable of so much more. You are capable of so much more. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. It's a really tricky topic. It's got a lot of moving parts to it. There is so much research and so much content online around this topic. And I've tried to add my view as someone who sees a lot of really, really strong, capable, qualified, amazing people play in this space. And my hope is that one day we don't have to talk about it, because you're feeling as capable and as confident as you need to be. I hope you will join us again for another episode of the Lida Citroën podcast. We have some amazing guests coming up. We've had some amazing guests. So if you've missed a couple episodes, go back into the archives and watch them, listen to them. And if you've enjoyed today's content, please share it with someone, share it on social media. That is how these podcasts grow and expand their reach. Until I see you next time, I wish you health, happiness, and all good things.
Thanks for tuning in to the Lida Citroën podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow the show and leave a review. It helps more people discover these inspiring conversations. For more tools, insights, and resources, visit Lida360.com or connect with Lida on LinkedIn. Until next time, remember, your influence has the power to make a real difference.